This is the Emmy Award-winning WB11 News Close-Up with Marvin Scott.
Good morning. Americans seem to love a good ghost story, demonic tales of horror and the supernatural. It has held their fascination from time immemorial. Consider, if you will, the most recent box office success, the thriller The Blair Witch Project. The precursor of that film was another horror tale that scared the daylights out of another generation. Later, I will be joined by noted parapsychologist Dr. Holzer, who will provide some insight into the psychic phenomena. Most people think the Amityville horror is a good, scary ghost story. What is not commonly known is that the film is based partially on fact, the murder of an entire family in that house 25 years ago today.
He fired 7 shots from a high-powered rifle.
Ronald DeFeo was demonically influenced in committing that horrible crime.
They were shots that left 6 members of one family dead in this charming Dutch colonial home, unceremoniously put a town on the map, and spawned a cottage industry for one of the most lucrative ghost stories of all time. It didn't take long for police to determine that 23-year-old Ronald DeFeo had murdered his mother and father, 2 brothers and 2 sisters as they slept.
The closest Ronnie ever explained as to why he did it is because at that time he felt that they were conspiring against him.
Some suggested DeFeo was after his father's $200,000 insurance policy, but followers of the occult believe something much more sinister was behind his murderous rampage.
Ron was into some very dark things. He was into some occult practices.
Ronnie DeFeo said that there was a black, dark mass or shadow alongside of him, which was obsessing his thoughts and telling him to kill everybody.
Was Ronnie possessed?
No. No. He was insane.
Rejecting that defense, a jury found DeFeo guilty and ordered him to serve 6 25 years to life sentences. Now at the Greenhaven Correctional Facility upstate, DeFeo was recently denied a request for parole. Despite earlier confessions, DeFeo's stories have wavered over the years, accusing others, including the mob, of committing the murders while he was smoking marijuana in the basement. In recent correspondence with me, he again suggested it was his sister Allison who killed everyone, and that he killed her in self-defense while wrestling for the gun. DeFeo writes, "Really, I need to find a real criminal lawyer, get the DNA testing done, and I am out the door, because the truth speaks for itself." Out of the brutal murders in this house, one of the biggest mysteries still lingering 25 years later is why none of the family members was awakened by the explosive burst of gunfire throughout the house. The Lutzes claim the house was haunted by evil spirits. Religious demonologist Ed Warren and his clairvoyant wife Lorraine, who operate a museum of the occult in Connecticut, came in to investigate.
There is no doubt in our mind that something of a demonic nature haunted that home.
We could sit here for 3 weeks, and I'll keep telling you each time it's a fraud.
Bill Weber was the trial lawyer for Ronald DeFeo, who was found guilty of killing his family in that house a year earlier.
The Lutzes took advantage of an unfortunate incident and built this supernatural story around it, but it's not true.
In letters to me from prison, DeFeo says it was he who was taken advantage of. Declares also that the Amityville horror is a hoax, that it's all about money and industry. The convicted killer sent me documents purportedly showing that his lawyer was after lucrative book and movie deals and accuses him of starting what has become one of the greatest ghost stories of all time.
I didn't start it, that's for sure.
You contributed to it?
I contributed, absolutely.
After the Lutzes fled the house, Weber says he met with them to discuss a book idea about the DeFeo murders, not a ghost story.
We sat down and we talked. We had a nice evening conversation.
So this story evolved over dinner with the Lutzes and a bottle of wine.
I think it was about 3 bottles of wine. Yes, about 3 bottles of wine.
So the story grew with each bottle of wine?
Each bottle became a better story.
It is definitely not a hoax.
The evidence that we would have to use would be the photographs that we had taken shows a ghostly little boy looking out of Missy's room. Seconds before, there was nothing there. Then you see a small boy's face with luminescent eyes.
As for the swarm of flies the Lutzes claimed infested the house in the cold of winter, Attorney Weber says that was the work of their creative minds, not demons.
I told them there were flies found in the house when the body of the older sister was discovered. From those flies, they created a complete supernatural scene in the sister's room.
Weber asserts that the idea for the green and black slime oozing from the walls came from crime scene photographs.
There was greenish-black substance around many of the doorknobs. They were the result of fingerprint powders. Those photographs, that was what constituted in the Lutz's mind the green slime that was coming out of the doors.
Another bizarre element to the unnerving story is the seemingly striking resemblance between homeowner George Lutz and the man who lived in that house before, convicted murderer Ronald DeFeo.
This is the crucifix which George Lutz used going throughout the house to try to cast out the evil that was there. But he simply wasn't strong enough to overpower what was there.
Whatever it was the Lutzes believed was in that house, it did not manifest itself the night I spent in the house 23 years ago with a group of parapsychologists who conducted a seance.
Whatever is here.
You're trying to harm them?
Yeah, and it's something that comes at you and makes your heart speed up, that kind of thing.
The demonic force was supposedly the strongest in the sewing room, where Lorraine Warren conducted another seance by candlelight. Other than a brief chill, after all, it was February, I felt nothing unusual.
But it did to me, Marvin, because I said to you, Marvin, I hope this is as close to hell as I'll ever get.
I heard them, Father. I heard voices.
Not I. The only persistent voice I heard that night was that of my crew, wanting to know when we were going to have the sandwiches we had brought along. The Amityville house appears to be quite peaceful now. There's been no evidence of any strange occurrences here since the Lutz family fled more than 20 years ago.
Since the Lutzes moved out, there have been 3 families that have lived in the house, and no one has had any supernatural or occult experience.
This house is not haunted. It never was haunted. It was a money-making fraud.
My feeling is that that home has been exorcised. And that is the only way anybody could live in peace in that home.
The current owners refuse to speak to us, but in an effort to detract the curious, they have changed the fan windows in the attic, and they have changed the address from 112 to 108 Ocean Avenue. A couple of footnotes to that report. George and Kathy Lutz, they still stick to their story, although they have not stuck together. Now divorced, George lives in Las Vegas, Kathy is in Arizona. Both have become devoted to their church. Ed and Lorraine Warren insist the photographs they use, including the ones in the report, the ones they use as evidence of paranormal activity, are not at all doctored, and they offer a $3,000 reward to anyone who can prove there was a conspiracy to create the Amityville story. And finally, often I am asked if I was at all frightened the night I spent in that house. Truthfully, the 2 hours I spent watching the movie with a rowdy, disruptive, pot-smoking audience was much more of a horror than the 6 hours I spent in that house. When we return, I'll be joined by noted parapsychologist Dr. Hans Holzer. The Amityville murders spawned a cottage industry of demonic tales. There have been 7 movies and 8 books, 2 of them written by our guest, Dr. Hans Holzer. He's a professor of parapsychology. Dr. Holzer is a prolific author who has written more than 100 books, including his latest, Psychic, True Paranormal Experiences. Dr. Holzer, thank you so much for joining us. You watched that report with great interest, and you were shaking your head quite frequently.
Oh, well,
you refute a lot of the things that were said in that report?
Well, this is not actually a horror story. It's just a horrible story, because I always like fiction and non-fiction separate, though. What I've seen here, of course, I've heard before. What is interesting to me is that the real cause of all this hullabaloo has not been mentioned by any of them, because they are not aware of it. Now, the house in question stands on an ancient Indian cemetery, and desecrating Indian cemeteries in other places has proven to be not a very good proposition. I don't know how you feel about life after death. I feel there is a continuance of existence in another dimension, shall we say. It has nothing to do with religion or beliefs or disbeliefs or the supernatural. There is another side to life, which we call the other side of life, and part of us, the inner self, proceeds into that world. Now, what we have here is not a house of horror. We do not have demons, because there are no such things as demons or devils. That's a fantasy that religious fanatics like to dream up. We have a couple in question here. And as far as Mr. Lutz is concerned, whatever he experienced may have been just ordinary poltergeist phenomena, that is to say noises and so on.
Okay, a lot of us remain skeptical. Here you are, you have studied the house in Amityville, and you have written over about 112 books now on this subject. Yeah. What can you tell us? Talk to us about this mound, this Indian burial ground that you talk about.
I have been to the house more than anybody else. I was there for the first time with the famous deep trance medium Ethel Myers, and we had an Indian come through her, an Indian chief, and on further investigation I discovered that the house was built on Indian burial ground. That
it was a shell mound. That was where they held prisoners. There were the Manasquan and the Shinnecock Indians had lived at that,
particularly,
in that region.
It so happened that I found out further that in 1905, a skeleton was partially washed out by a rainstorm, and this skeleton had the skull of the skeleton was broken off by a young fellow, a child. And from that moment on, phenomena started to happen in the house.
Now, explain, if you will, Dr. Holzer, how is the fact that there was a cemetery that you say existed there, how would that create these strange occurrences, the location?
Because, again, you may feel otherwise about life after that and continuous of existence, but assuming that there is, and I know from the evidence I have accumulated over 30 years, the Indian chief, whose skeleton was being desecrated, wasn't amused by it. And if you're somebody knocked off your block, you wouldn't particularly like it either. And apparently somebody did, played football with it, and that aroused the Indian to a warpath against anybody living in the house. That's when the fun started. There was another house on that spot.
Let me quote, please, from William Lauder. He's the director of the Amityville Historical Society, directly on your point about a burial ground. It's totally nonsense, he says. There was no cemetery or sacred ground there. It is a shame to prolong and keep this myth going. It's only for monetary gain. Anyone who believes it is a victim. It's a shameful intrusion upon reason and totally devoid of any foundation in fact.
Well, that's also not true, because I have that information from the chief librarian of Amityville, who researched it for me, and this is on tape because we made a documentary in 1977, in which he appears, where he clearly states that there was, in fact, an Indian burial ground on that stuff. Now, this comes from the librarian of Amityville, and it is on the record. So whatever you read to me is just not true.
But there are reasonable people out there who look at this, they read it. There are some people who want to believe it, and there are others who say, show me evidence that it's true. What evidence do you provide, Dr. Holzer, that this is true, that you're saying that there are forces of people who lived at another time, who were buried in a ground there, who are behind these forces and the supernatural occurrences?
Don't misquote me, please. I didn't say anything like that.
I'm trying to interpret and
understand. You be very careful.
Try to understand.
Yeah. No, I didn't say anything of the sort. I said that the librarian of Amityville went to great extent. At first, he didn't like to talk about
it. Prior to that, you were saying that because it was a burial ground, that is what is bringing out these forces, this overpowering force that is creating these problems.
Now,
Did I misinterpret that?
Don't write another fiction book.
Then please clarify it.
It's very simple. Before 1905, there was another house on that spot, which was built in 1782. See, I do my research very carefully. I don't make it up. And that house was perfectly calm until in 1905. Then suddenly, in the other house, phenomena started to occur of such a kind. People moved in and out. Somebody committed suicide. They moved the house to another spot in Amityville, and it still exists there, and nothing ever happened to that 1782 house again. Instead, there was an empty lot. On that empty lot, in 1928, a new house was built, the one that is still there. This house was built and was then inhabited by the DeFeo family. The DeFeos started having problems with it, of what we call poltergeist phenomena, footsteps and objects moving, that sort of thing. among the DeFeos was a young man who was a natural medium. That happens. People are born that way with a sixth sense. He had that ability. If you look at the history of this young man, you find that he was unusual. He was not crazy, Mr. Weber notwithstanding. Mr. Weber is a very fine attorney, but he also makes up stories.
Ron DeFeo was also reportedly a believer of the occult. Is that true?
No. Young DeFeo neither believed nor knew the first thing about it. I interviewed him in prison, at Dannemora prison. I went in there with a tape recorder and we talked, because he apparently trusted me. Young DeFeo told the truth that he didn't remember killing his family. In fact, he, in a sense, from my point of view, was a victim too. He was taken over by the spirit of this Indian. Now, this sounds strange to you, but when you have done as much work in this field as I have, you will accept that there is a part of us that goes on into another dimension. This Indian chief's entity took over the young man and killed his family through his body. And that is all there is to this house. No slime, no flies. This is all Hollywood invention. And it is just not true.
As an academic,
yeah,
and as a reasonable and understanding man, for folks out there who try to understand, how does something possess the body? How can you, as succinctly as possible, explain that?
The literature on that is extremely large. I myself contributed to it in a book called Possessed. It has nothing to do with religious possession and exorcism. Please, forget religion on this. This is a fact that someone who continues in existence without a physical body and requires to express himself in our world will then enter the physical body of a suitable individual and makes him do the things that he wants to do. And that is all there is to the Amityville house. There is no haunting. There is no ghost. There's an Indian chief who's still mad as hell.
And that could have been the dark shadow which Ron DeFeo allegedly claimed was hovering
Could have
over
been is not words I use. The fact is DeFeo doesn't recall shooting people. It is another important scientific fact which you forgot. Nobody heard the shots in the entire neighborhood.
Phantomania.
Yeah, nobody heard it. Yeah, the people did not run from it because they didn't hear the shots either. And this is a very common phenomenon in parapsychology. I've had this happen to me in so-called haunted houses. The tape recorder suddenly will not work, or there is no sound because, my friend, a haunted atmosphere is a magnetic atmosphere, and anything that is magnetic will automatically be affected and
so
stop.
They were frozen.
Yeah, but frozen. That's why they didn't hear it. That's why they didn't hear it.
Let's take a break. But you have some photographs. I want to show those photographs when we come back, which you say provide further evidence of a little bit bizarre occurrences caused by that cemetery, which was located where the house in Amityville is now located. We'll be right back with Amityville, Horror or Hoax. Now, back with Dr. Hans Holzer, you spent time in the house at formerly known as 112 Ocean Avenue, and you took some photographs there, which you say provide further evidence of possession.
I did my team. I brought a team of technicians with me, a psychic photographer who uses a Polaroid camera. You cannot fake.
What does this show?
This is showing me interrogating a medium, Mrs. Myers, who's in deep trance. And at that moment, the Indian is speaking to her and hollering like crazy and being very angry with a male voice. And we have that on tape, by the way. And
but this photograph looks like there was a little movement and a shadow.
Yeah, but there wasn't. This is the funny part. There is some whitish thing around me for which there's no explanation. Look at in front of me. That looks like a pair of pants, which is also not there. Now show the next one, please.
Let's see the next photograph. Okay, what does this show?
This is a room in which normally should show a woman seated on a chair. Instead, we have these whitish masses. We call this ectoplasm. It's a formation of a figure. Before a figure is formed, this is the first step towards it. And this is not uncommon in a situation like this. Now the next one, please.
See the next picture, this...
Now, you see on the right, Ethel Myers, still deeply entranced, out cold, so to speak. And on the left there's something other than me. And that's all I'm saying. These are genuine pictures. They were taken by Polaroid by Jerry Wagner, who's a technician who works with me. And there's something in that house, but it isn't a horror. It isn't a hoax. It is simply an Indian chief on the warpath, if you don't mind. And I have sympathy for him.
What about the photograph I showed in the report earlier of the boy with the luminescent eyes looking out of Missy's room?
No comment.
You don't believe that's
No,
anything?
no.
So you're saying that Ron DeFeo was possessed?
Ron DeFeo was possessed. He did tell the truth about that he didn't remember doing it. He did it. He told it to me when I interviewed him in prison. And I think that's all there is to it. The rest is fantasy, religious fantasy, and perhaps also commercial interests.
How do you explain the fact that it's now been 20-some-odd years,
25.
24 years, I think,
Yeah.
since the Lutzes
Yeah.
fled. Yeah, almost 24 years. And no one has experienced anything there in 24 years. You've had the Cromartys moved in, you had another family moved in, and now there's a third family.
Because there's something missing on the other end of the telephone for something like this to work. The entity is there, but if the person is not receptive, that is, the person is not psychic, deeply psychic receptive, nothing will happen, even though it continues to be there. I assure you, the Indian chief hasn't gone away.
So tell me, is this a horror or a hoax?
Neither. It's a house where an Indian chief was buried, and he doesn't like being fooled around with and having people living on his land.
Why is it you feel, Dr. Holzer, people want to cling to this story?
Partially because they have fantasies that they believe in, and partially because there's money to be made. And I feel kind of sorry for all this.
And as much as the folks in Amityville want the story to go away, it's going to continue.
It's continuing, and the more they say go away, the more they stay, because from the Indian chief's point of view, he's got a case. And as far as DeFeo is concerned, he has a case too, believe it or not.
Believe it or not, Dr. Hans Holzer, thank you very much for joining us and providing this insight.
It's a pleasure.
As a postscript, I must note that the people who live in Amityville, Long Island, are proud of their community and its richness in history that dates back to the 16th century. It was the home of Will Rogers, Walt Whitman, Governor Al Smith, and Annie Oakley. The father of our country, George Washington, slept there at the Zebulon Ketchum Inn. Facts quickly forgotten by a world that wants to believe in the seemingly unbelievable. What do you think? That's our program for this week. If you want to know more about 11 News Close-Up, check out our website at www.wb11.com. Up next on Best Talk, the digital divide and what's being done to link the black community onto the information superhighway. I'm Marvin Scott. Thanks so much for joining us. Have a terrific weekend.